Good evening, America. Tonight we do not begin in the modern age of glowing screens, algorithmic outrage, and surveillance wrapped in the silk of convenience. No. Tonight we journey backward. Backward to the year 1798. A fragile republic, a frightened government, and a people who had only just escaped the iron grip of monarchy, only to discover how quickly fear can convince free men to rebuild the cage themselves. You know this chapter by its official title, the Alien and Sedition Acts, a collection of laws passed under the administration of John Adams and championed by the Federalist Party during a period of escalating paranoia between the young United States and revolutionary France. But titles can be deceptive. And history, you see, is often written in polite language to disguise profoundly impolite intentions. So let us call them what they truly were: the legalization of fear, the criminalization of dissent. The moment a government born from rebellion began trembling at the sound of its own citizens speaking freely. You must understand the atmosphere of the time. The young American republic stood divided. On one side stood the Federalists, men like Alexander Hamilton and Adams, who believed in a strong, centralized government, close relations with United Kingdom, and strict social order. On the other side stood the Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, men who feared concentrated power and believed liberty could only survive through constant vigilance against government overreach. And hovering above it all was fear, the shadow of the French Revolution, the guillotine, the riots, the blood. Federalists became convinced that radical immigrants, newspaper publishers, and political opponents would drag America into chaos. Sound familiar? Fear is timeless. Only the costumes change. In 1798, Congress passed 4 separate laws, 4 acts, 4 fractures in the foundation of liberty. The first, the Naturalization Act. This law increased the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 years to 14. Why? Because immigrants often supported Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. You see, the language of protecting the nation has always had a curious tendency to target politically inconvenient populations. Then came the Alien Friends Act. A president could deport any non-citizen deemed dangerous. No trial required, no due process guaranteed. Merely suspicion, merely accusation, merely the whisper that someone somewhere posed a threat to national stability. Then came the Alien Enemies Act, a law allowing the detention or deportation of male citizens from hostile nations during wartime. And unlike the others, this one never fully disappeared. Even now, fragments of its authority still linger within the machinery of American law. History rarely dies, it simply changes uniforms. But the most infamous of them all, the act that revealed the trembling insecurity of power itself, was the Sedition Act. Now listen carefully, because this is where republics reveal whether they truly believe in freedom or merely enjoy the sound of the word. The Sedition Act made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government, Congress, or the President. Think about that. The same nation born from pamphlets attacking the British Crown suddenly criminalized criticism of its own leadership. A revolution built on dissent had begun prosecuting dissenters. Newspaper editors were arrested, political opponents were targeted, writers were fined and jailed. One of the most famous cases involved Congressman Matthew Lyon, who criticized Adams and was sentenced to prison. And what happened after he was jailed? Did the people recoil? Did they silence themselves? No, they re-elected him from prison. Because even then, some Americans understood a dangerous truth. When governments fear criticism, criticism becomes a civic duty. The Federalists claimed these laws were necessary for national security, necessary to preserve order, necessary to protect the Republic from foreign influence and internal instability. And perhaps some even believed it sincerely. That is the tragedy of history. Authoritarianism rarely introduces itself as tyranny. It arrives draped in patriotism, wrapped in emergency, escorted by panic, and applauded by citizens convinced they are protecting freedom by surrendering it. You see, every age creates its own vocabulary of fear. In 1798, it was French radicals. In other eras, it became anarchists during the First Red Scare, communists during the McCarthyism, civil rights activists monitored under programs like COINTELPRO, whistleblowers, journalists, protesters, immigrants, dissidents. The labels evolve, the mechanism remains. Fear the outsider, fear the critic, fear the speaker, fear the question, and above all else, fear the citizen who refuses to be silent. But history is merciless toward governments that overreach. The backlash against the Alien and Sedition Acts became immense. Jefferson and Madison secretly drafted the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, arguing that states could challenge unconstitutional federal laws. The Federalists, once dominant, began collapsing under public outrage. And in the election of 1800, Adams lost to Jefferson in what became known as the Revolution of 1800, a peaceful transfer of power, a rejection of fear politics, and eventually most of the acts either expired or were repealed. But the scar remained. Because once a government discovers it can weaponize fear, it rarely forgets the lesson. And tonight I ask you, how different are we now? Do not answer emotionally. Answer honestly. How many times has fear been used to justify surveillance? How many times has national security expanded government authority? How many times have citizens applauded censorship so long as it targeted people they disliked? How many times have critics been labeled dangerous merely for questioning official narratives? Every generation believes it would resist repression if it appeared, but repression rarely arrives wearing a skull upon its chest. It arrives carrying promises, protection, security, unity, safety, and slowly, piece by piece, people surrender liberties they do not realize they will one day need. The Alien and Sedition Acts were not merely laws. They were a warning, a reminder that liberty is not self-sustaining. Freedom does not survive because parchment says it should. Rights do not endure because politicians praise them during speeches. Liberty survives only when people defend the rights of others, especially the unpopular, especially the inconvenient, especially the dissenters. Because once a government gains the power to decide which opinions are acceptable, freedom becomes temporary. And temporary freedom is merely delayed obedience. So remember this chapter well. Remember how quickly a frightened republic flirted with authoritarianism. Remember how fear transformed criticism into criminality. Remember how men who once fought tyranny nearly recreated it themselves. And remember, the greatest threat to liberty has never been the foreign invader standing at the gate. It is the frightened citizen who willingly opens it from within. Because the most dangerous prison is the one people build themselves. Good night.